Welcome to the first of my 2 short videos on clinical writing, prepared for and in collaboration with the Journal of Analytical Psychology. This video illustrates features of writing clinical narratives. My second video explains how to draw teaching points out of your clinical story to comment on its meaning and significance. Your paper's integrity depends on 2 factors. First, providing sufficient and vivid enough details of your clinical story for readers to enter into your experience with your patient and yourself. And second, closely linking your clinical story to the concepts you use to understand it. Most clinical papers combine these 2 perspectives, the narrative and the conceptual. Before we dig in, let me explain some important logistics. You will find backup material and writing exercises for both my videos on the JAP website and in my book, The Structure and Spontaneity of Clinical Prose, a writer's guide for psychoanalysts and psychotherapists. All the material I quote in the videos is with the kind permission of each author. I am grateful to them and also to John Wiley & Sons, publishers of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, for permission to quote from the journal. You will find the complete references to the works I use, links to the papers I quote, the quotations themselves, and additional links to the JAP submission pages in my supplementary materials document on the JAP website. Now that you know where to find things, let's look at narrative summaries and vignettes, the workhorses of clinical writing. Narrative summaries introduce important information, create context, identify patterns, summarize what has happened over time. They are indispensable in presenting the sweep and dynamics of a longer treatment or of longer segments of our clinical work. Here's one by Susanna Wright, and I quote, "During the years I had known Anna, she had struggled with poverty, poor housing, backbreaking physical work, a strange language, strange culture, and social isolation. She would visit me in my consulting room and have to battle not only with her envy of what appeared to be my comfortable circumstances, but also with a lonely conviction that I could never understand how hard it was for her. Nevertheless, her determined fighting, as she would say, led her to years of study, and finally, only a few months before that day, to work that began to open up opportunities more like those she had left behind in her country of origin. Perhaps her progress in establishing a place in the new country reflected some use Anna had been able to make of me. But she felt both angry and guilty toward me, saying, 'Immigrants should be grateful for what they get, not be angry when things are difficult.' She described me as her tour guide, a native who helped her with the ways of the foreign country. And following the years of work that I felt were beginning to pay off in new possibilities for her, she was beginning to form a different point of view. She was thinking of migrating again to be closer to her family. She wanted a better life. Rather in the way that when we met in the street, Anna was walking away from our appointment, going home. This felt to me to be a statement by Anna that she did not see her analysis as providing hope of change from her internal experience of being alienated, apart. She was thinking of giving up on the dreams and the ambitions that brought her to London and proposed her own solution, her old solution, an external repetition, another migration in search of a better place," end quote. Now, Wright's narrative summary does a lot of work. We learn what Anna was struggling with over the years, her envy of her analyst's circumstances, her core belief that she will never be understood, her determination, the opportunities that are beginning to open for her. Wright then focuses on their relationship, the differences in their points of view, and migration as a recurrent theme in Anna's life. Like narrative summaries, vignettes are also brief, but they're structured differently. They're focused to illustrate a specific idea. Here's one by Favreau and Candelarii that describes a high school dropout who leads a nocturnal virtual life. And I quote, "Jason is a highly intellectual 16-year-old boy who, in the early years of secondary school, begins to manifest the first symptoms of school refusal. Following an improvement in the situation when he was 15, the following year he stops going to school altogether. With his family left feeling powerless, the boy, shut up in his room, inverts the patterns of sleep and wakefulness, becoming awake at night, playing his favorite online video game, Minecraft, and sleeping during the day. His virtual friends help him to feel gratified and competent. And so this alternate reality acts as a substitute and a valid refuge against the anxiety and shame associated with the idea of presenting himself in an authentic social context. Conversely, relationships with friends and actual flesh and blood and with his parents become impoverished and even actively avoided. Furthermore, whereas at school, Jason was often ignored by his classmates, in the online video game world, he has acquired the status of a lamer, someone who is willfully ignorant of how things work and whose main aim is to try to do as much damage as possible, earning him a certain prestige and notoriety among his peers." End quote. Besides describing Jason and his alternate reality, this vignette identifies the functions his virtual life fulfills, thus linking narrative details to an interpretation of what is described. While narrative summaries and vignettes are the workhorses of our clinical prose, they cannot illustrate the complexity of therapeutic process or bring it to life. They usually give little or no access to the internal experience of the therapist and do not present enough information for us to independently evaluate what is reported. Instead, we are forced to rely on the narrator's say-so. So what can we do as writers to offer our readers more? We can start by not relying on summaries and vignettes exclusively. When we use vignettes, we can make them more detailed and experience near. We can write them more like immediate scenes, like something that's filmable, that seems to be playing out before our eyes, and also includes access to the analyst's internal experience. What follows is an artful example by Joan and Neville Symington, used to illustrate Bion's concept of the container contained. In it, an analyst meets a 33-year-old mentally handicapped man who may be capable of doing more than menial tasks in the shelter workshop. The authors tell us that words, quote, would sometimes dribble out of the corner, end quote, of the patient's mouth. For example, and I quote, "I am 33 years old, and is that nothing?" And a moment later, "Can you give me a picture of who I am?" The analyst said, "The fact that you feel they have been 33 years of emptiness, waste, and nothingness is so painful that it's better to have people's pictures of you than to face this ghastly nothingness. He replied, well, if you won't give me a picture, what do I come here for? The analyst stood up, placed himself alongside him, and said, it's like this. There, in front of us, is 33 years of waste, nothing, and emptiness. It's like sitting in a train, and opposite sits a man with a wounded and diseased face. And it is so horrific that you have to hold pictures up in front of you because it is more than you can bear. But the reason you come to see me is perhaps there is just a possibility that if you have me beside you, then you can look at it. End quote. This vignette shows how the analyst who sits by the patient's side can help him contain his pain and bear the unbearable. It's not written as a narrative summary. Instead, it brings a clinical moment alive with dialogue. It's written in the present tense. We can see what's happening as if the scene is being played out before our eyes. It's an immediate scene, something that's filmable. In the example of an immediate scene that follows, notice how Sylvia Pereira gives us access to her internal experience. And I quote, as Judith sits on the couch, I repeat her nod, looking at her, feeling my facial expression is both calm and welcoming. She does not respond. I sense I need to sit as quietly as she does, and I begin to feel into the increasingly charged atmosphere between us. I am trying to be present to all my perceptions. They form into an initial impression of someone who is depressed, vigilant, and in disguise, knowing all the social rituals that form an appropriate persona, and dutifully, slightly defensively accommodating them. So after a silence, I try another greeting behavior and a question. Hello? Pause. Did you get here okay? A kind of Zen opening, but yielding only another pause and another question. Do you want to tell me what brings you today? Judith gives me a quick, wordless look and returns her gaze to the window. I feel a pull to engage her in social greeting behavior, but sense that that would violate some process already in operation. And so I wait, trying to stay present to the feel of space that is not really between us. And yet she is already compelled by her role, and I am trying to observe and discover the roles I am to serve in what may become our mutual performance. End quote. Pereira uses the scene to illustrate that something has already begun despite the patient's silence. The two of them are, as she writes, quote, already engaged in a drama written by the great playwright self or God. Whomever was joining our separate scripts together for this performance of basic psychological facts. Later, end quote. Later, and with the Symingtons and Pereira as your guide, write an immediate scene of your own using dialogue in the present tense. To make your clinical writing more effective, lively, and memorable, include at least one immediate scene. Use it to present the most important interaction of your clinical work that you want to describe, and give your readers access to your internal experience as Pereira does. Narrative summaries, vignettes, and immediate scenes all of which you've just learned about, are the building blocks of the narrative axis of your paper, the storyline that runs through time. I represent the narrative axis with a horizontal line, like a timeline. You can also think of it as the story's plot. But there's a second, equally important dimension to clinical prose that I call the conceptual axis, which I will discuss in my second video. See you there.